Thanks for coming out this evening. It is a pleasure to come and join you and talk a little bit about this relationship that we have with both neighbors, but I'm going to focus on Mexico. And most Americans do not know that the one country in the world that touches more Americans every day is Mexico. No country is anywhere close, because they're our largest trading partner. We have many millions of Mexican Americans in this country. We have bad things across the border coming north. We have drugs coming north. We send guns south. We have many migrants that come to the United States, and they all have to cross Mexico to get here. It's just a relationship that has so many intertwining connections between both countries. That's very much unlike, Irish Americans, a lot of Irish Americans, Polish Americans, a lot of Polish Americans. But this is every day, just touching many people, touching millions and millions of jobs in both countries and jobs across North America that are tied together because of this web that we've had historically and woven even more tightly since the 1990s. We go to the next slide, please. Maybe. There we go. Okay, so this is it's something that I call an intermestic relationship. You can all keep reading and taking a look. There's a lot of information on there. And there'll be a lot of information on all these slides, so you can ask questions later and do things. Intermestic means it's international and domestic at the same time. And what it means is in both countries, what happens in the relationship is part of domestic politics. And the relation with the other country often touches on issues that are really important domestically on the other side of the border. Now, this is also true of Canada, so it's true for both Canada and Mexico. But I think it's fair to say that there are many more hot-button issues in the relationship with Mexico. So we'll talk a little bit about this. You can see the numbers here. We've gone through different periods of close and distant relationships, even in the last decade or so. It really, to have a very successful partnership, you need the heads of both governments to recognize the importance of the partnership and try to build that partnership. And that is often not the case for Mexico and the United States, or across all three countries in North America. So let's talk about this. Next slide. So this is just to show, you can read through it, and we're going to talk about this, but this is just showing there are positive and negative things that are going on at the same time in this relationship. And that's part of the mix. So there are going to be things where both governments are happy and are working to get a closer working relationship. And then there are things that are undermining the other part of the coordination that are going on at the same time. And that makes this a very challenging relationship to manage for both governments and for those who have an interest in the relationship. For example, the many US companies who depend on the trade relationship with Mexico to get some of their parts coming up here, or to send some of their parts to Mexico to get put into other things. They depend on that working very well. But if the border gets disrupted because there are too many migrants trying to get in, or because there's too much violence along the border for some of the criminal groups working, that very much disrupts it. Or if there's a COVID pandemic which shuts the border down for a while, that's a big problem. Next, please. So Mexico became our largest trading partner in 2023. It's been one of the top three for many years now. China used to be number one. After Trump put all the tariffs on China, it diverted trade to Canada and Mexico. And China became the third largest partner, and that percentage has shrunk since. Canada was number one for a year or two, and Mexico was number one, then Canada. But Mexico actually, just because of its integration with the United States production system, consistently moved to number one. So there's no country in the world that co-produces things more than Mexico does with the United States. And we'll see that again as we go forward. Next slide, please. So that total of trade, you don't have to remember the total trade. The easiest thing to remember is it's about $1.5 million a minute. So if I've been talking for 5 minutes here, that is $7.5 million worth of trade that's gone across the border. And that is up from when I was ambassador. It was almost $1 million a minute. And so it's moved up $500,000 a minute, which is an awful lot in the last 10 years or so. Next slide, please. Along the border, there are 1 million normal, legal, completely up and up border crossings each day. Now, some of those border crossings are the same people because people go back and forth to work on each side of the border. They drive things across, they drive things back. Some of them work in factories in the United States. They go to school in the United States. Some come back and they work in the factories in Mexico, and they're U.S. citizens, U.S. residents. So there's a lot of people just crossing the border as part of the normal day-to-day activity. We focus, of course, on those who try to come across irregularly, but they're completely drowned in numbers by the amount of normal, regular, uncontroversial transit. Next slide, please. So again, you can see this is the pattern of U.S.-Mexico trade since NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, came into effect in 1994. It's increased 6 times, sixfold, U.S.-Mexican trade since then. I happened to be in on the NSC when NAFTA was passed, and I remember the big argument was, well, this is really important because there's 700,000 American jobs that depend on this trade. Well, as you're going to see in a couple of minutes, there are now about 7 times that number of U.S. jobs that depend on this trade between the two countries. Next slide, please. And then again, this is probably the most important thing to remember. Mexico, what this is saying in 2010, so it's old, but nobody's done the study again since, but it's still approximately correct. When a manufactured good came in, a car comes in from Mexico, 40% of that car is actually U.S. product, or the value of that car is U.S. product. And then from Canada, as you can see, it was 25%. Then look at all the other countries down here, how small that is. What this shows is we actually make things together with Mexico. Things go back and forth across the border as they're being built. And that's part of what the private sector did under NAFTA. They built this big co-production network. There's more co-production in North America than there is in Europe, in the European Union. They trade more, and their economies are more integrated overall, but they don't do as much co-production as we do in North America. Next slide. So as you can see, there are about 5 million jobs that depend on this, and you can see where all those jobs are. No surprise on the border, but they're not just along the border, right? It's the dark colors. So there's a lot in the center of the industrial center of the country, at New York, other places. Next slide, please. This is another way to, these are the countries that, states that export most to Mexico. And again, you can see it's not just the border states. A lot of states profit from this relationship with Mexico. Next, please. Also, if you took the the states on each side of the border, put them together as one country, they would be the 3rd or 4th largest economy in the world. They would be the 3rd largest if you don't count the EU as one economy, and they would be the 4th largest if you count the EU, the European Union, as one economy. So there's a lot of wealth along these states and a lot of productivity. Next, please. One other thing just to mention, all those individuals of Mexican origin in the United States, some of whom are U.S. citizens, some of whom are not, send a lot of money back home to support their families. And so you can see here $63 billion in 2023 went from Mexican Americans or Mexicans in the United States back to support the Mexican economy, back to those families. Next slide, please. Okay, now let's look at the border. Next slide. So these are all the border crossings. The little red dots are the formal border crossing, and that's where most of the trade, it's also where most of the drugs cross the border. They do not cross in between the formal border slots. They are hidden in cars, in people, in trucks, in buses, in most cases. U.S. guns cross through these formal border places, and they also cross through less formal places. But most of the illicit trade is through there. You can go to the next one. This is just to show that one of the big industries for both countries is tourism, going in both directions. How many of you have been to Mexico for a vacation? There you go. Well, you know that. A lot of Mexicans also come to the United States for a vacation. And this brings in a lot of money for both countries. You can see the numbers here. But it's something we often don't pay attention to, right? We look at all the hard stuff we make. Well, services is also a big positive thing between Mexico and the United States. Next, please. This is just to show most of that trade is in trucks. So you can see this is another way of measuring trade. You know that first graph of the trade going up? Well, you can also measure trade by the number of trucks crossing the border. And so just showing you there are a lot of trucks that go across the border. Next, please. Now, we'll talk about migration a little bit more, and you can ask questions about it later. But what I like to do is put this up. This goes from the 1960, way down there, to really, this is 2023. This is only a partial year, so don't look at that. But you can see we've had big waves of migration coming across that border for a long time. So people get all upset and think this is a new thing, but a lot of you already know. Many Americans don't know. This has been a challenge for many, many years. People looking for jobs, you know, looking for a better life, trying to get to the United States. So it's not a new thing. What's become new more recently is that there are people from many more countries trying to come across that border, and we'll talk about that as we go forward. Next slide, please. In the United States right now, unauthorized immigrants, the largest number are Mexican in the United States. Some people would get in trouble for saying illegally here, so we just say unauthorized Mexicans. There are about 10.7 million Mexican-born individuals in the United States. All of those are not irregular, are not unauthorized. But it's the largest single nationality chunk of our migrant population are from Mexico. And you can see this change, this black top line, are Mexicans in the United States as a percentage of all migrants. And you can see other countries actually surpassed, about 2015, surpassed Mexicans as totaling more, a bigger total in the US. Next, please, than Mexicans. So this is a complicated slide, but each of these lines are the last 4 years, different colors. And what you could track here if you wanted to is this is showing basically how many people have come in each different year. And so the record years that we've had were 2022 and 2023. 2022 being bigger than 2023 fiscal years. So far this year in 2024, the numbers have dropped. They've dropped because Mexico started cooperating more seriously to help manage all the migrants coming forward. I believe they are conscious of the impact this could have on the US election, and they are having people work harder. It is a challenge for Mexico because Mexico does not have the same kind of resources that we do to deploy along its borders. But I think they've been working very hard in the last few months to help keep these numbers down. Next slide, please. So you can see This is the rise of people who have claimed asylum in the United States. You can see that we now have about 8 million people in the United States whose are still pending decisions. So that's a lot of people. Next. Again, this is just a picture over time, 1980 forward. You can see the jumps, so you can see big things that happen along there. Again, just a reminder that people move for a lot of reasons. It's often economic crises in their home countries, or wars in their home countries, or great violence in their home countries that finally make people say, I got to get out of here, I got to get my family out of here, and they start moving. It's some people, of course, just on their own, they take the adventure, they like to do that, but most people know. They're usually pushed by something, some need. And so I think we're going to see, we're not going to see this end anytime soon, these migration flows. And I want to remind everybody that this isn't just happening in the United States, it's happening all over the world. Look at there are more migrants on the move all over the world than we have seen in decades. Next, please. So this is countries of origin. Show you here. Mexico is the light blue. So as you can see all along, they've been pretty big, except for this 2013-2014 period when Central Americans came in big numbers. Then the Central Americans, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and then other countries are down here, but growing. And so we're now seeing people at our southern border from India, many from Africa, from other places coming to try to get in. Ukrainians, there was a big wave of Ukrainians at one point. Next slide, please. All right, let's switch to crime. Next slide, please. So, big driver of the need to cooperate with Mexico on crime has been the number of overdose deaths in the United States, is from opioids especially. Opioids being heroin is the main natural opioid that causes death. Synthetic opioids, the main one that's known as fentanyl. You can see that this rise in numbers. We've been over 100,000 deaths for the last several years from all overdose deaths, and about 2/3 of those or more, about 75,000, have been from synthetic opioids in the United States. These numbers have actually very happily leveled off in the past couple of years, and a figure today came out saying it was only 107,000 for last year. But it's leveled off not because drug use has gone down, it's because the antidote has been spread all over the country, and people have been trained in all sorts of universities and other places to apply that antidote and thus keep people alive. I believe if we actually had number of overdoses, not overdose deaths, we would see this is actually quite a bit higher still. We still have a real epidemic in the United States. Most of those synthetic opioids are coming through Mexico into the United States. Two large cartels, which are really sort of conglomerates, have been controlling those flows, and they're fed by precursor chemicals from China. They are then mixed and made into fentanyl and into pills in Mexico. Next slide, please. So then the driver from the Mexican side for cooperation should be insecurity in Mexico, because these criminal groups don't just traffic drugs, they fight with each other for control of the drug routes. Their people take up other crime and extortion and other kind of criminal activities while they're not moving the drugs. They still need to make money, and so a lot of Mexicans have suffered. You can see that there were times in recent years where this is a perception of insecurity in Mexico. We're higher, but still, right now, the average Mexican, 61% say they feel unsafe in their own cities. That's a lot of people feeling unsafe in their city, even if it's come down a bit from the height. Next, please. And in fact, if you look at the current president of Mexico, goes by his initials AMLO. His name is Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. His largest area where he's criticized is his handling of public security, because security in Mexico is really bad, fueled by these organized groups. Now, it's up to the Mexicans to solve that, but if they actually had good and close cooperation with us, I believe we could help them solve that better than we're able to do right now. Next slide, please. Now, just to mention, AMLO, who I now mentioned in Mexico, is really popular. He's coming up, there's a new election on the 2nd of June. He cannot run again. Mexican presidents can only run for one 6-year term. He has a chosen successor. But the really interesting thing about AMLO is he's remained popular through his whole 6-year term. No recent Mexican president has done that. He's a wonderful communicator to the common Mexican. You've seen some American politicians who are very good communicators to their base. Well, AMLO is a very good communicator to his base that overrides people's upsetness that he hasn't done the best on all the issues. I don't completely understand that, especially if I were scared of my city to go out, but that's the way it is. Next slide, please. So, however, in Mexico, these bar graphs are the number of homicides each year in Mexico. And so what you can see, here's when Lopez Obrador was elected here in 2018. So you actually had the highest, this one actually is supposed to be bigger than that, even though that might look a little bit bigger. But the record for homicides in a year in Mexico was 2019. It has come down since then, but AMLO's 6-year term has set the record for modern Mexican presidents, or any Mexican president since the Civil War, for the number of homicides, the number of deaths in Mexico. This violence has cost Mexico about an estimated 18% of its GDP, so about $230 billion. The criminal groups make $20 to $30 billion a year from Americans who buy their drugs. They use a lot of that money to buy guns in the United States and have them smuggled back into Mexico to help the criminal groups be more forceful and powerful in Mexico. And they use other money to buy off officials in a combination usually of threat and offers of money. Next slide, please. This just shows, these are a partial looking at guns found in Mexico in arrests and other things. About 68% of those guns either were made in the United States or transited through the United States. Next slide, please. So we've tried over these years to build a better cooperation with Mexico, and we've had moments where we've had close cooperation, but it has not been sustained. It has been a hard cooperative relationship to work through. And this is all up here just to show all the different efforts that we've made to try and get through. So let's go to the next one, please. And we had basically 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020 were years of very poor cooperation between the two countries. Now, 2021, you can go to the next slide, we set up a new high-level security dialogue. And the Biden administration decided to try to set up a new framework to try to convince the president of Mexico to cooperate better with us. He really disliked what was called the Merida program, which was a U.S.-Mexico cooperation framework that actually had some moments of success, not overall successful. So they set up this new effort to try to both deal with the supply of drugs, but also to deal with the health and demand problems on the other side. So you're going to deal with both supply and demand, not just law enforcement, but what's drawing the drugs in, what are some of the weaknesses. So this improved U.S.-Mexico cooperation, but not nearly as much as is needed. So there's a lot more still to do, and it really has to do with the standoffish approach of Mexico's president, who is willing to do some cooperation with us, but is really worried that the United States would get too much into their knickers, as we might say, and is very nationalistic about that. Next, please. So at the same time we've been trying to do this, this is just a figure of the amount of fentanyl seized by our border authorities. And as you can see, this fentanyl seizures were up 241% in the last few fiscal years. That's a lot of stuff that was still flowing from Mexico into the United States. Next slide, please. So basically, I'm going to leave this right now, but this is a quick look at all the things that continue to trouble this cooperation on security, and we can talk about that if you have some questions. But there's a lot of work still needed to improve this cooperation between the two countries to the benefit of both countries. And there's a lot of benefit that could happen if we were actually working well together. Next slide, please. Okay, let's look at trade. Next slide, please. So again, trade across all of North America has grown also significantly. We trade more with our two partners in North America, twice of what we trade with China and more than we trade with all of the European Union put together. So it's a very big trading relationship. About 11, 12 million US jobs are supported by this trade. About up to 17 million, 15 to 17 million jobs across the whole North America are supported by this trade. So it really is key to a lot of people's livelihood. About 50% of all the trade in North America goes into some final product in another country. So again, that goes back to this fact that we build things together. Next slide, please. This shows, you can see the graphics of the trade, the two biggest trades being bilateral, Canada and the US, and Mexico and the United States. But you can see that's grown 4 times since the early 1990s. Next slide, please. Interesting thing here, at the 20-year anniversary, they did a study of NAFTA because, as you may remember, and many of you might have felt this, NAFTA was not very popular. A lot of people didn't like NAFTA. Actually, what this study showed is because NAFTA existed, there was an economic payoff of $400 a year for every single American citizen. That would not exist if we didn't have the synergies of co-production among the 3 countries. So that made all your cars cheaper because we built part of it in the United States, part of it in Mexico, part of it in Canada, part of it in the United States, etc. And so NAFTA actually brought a lot of economic benefit, even though practically everybody in the United States did not know that. They didn't read these studies, right? Like this study and other things. It was much easier to criticize. There are a lot of reasons why it's easy to criticize, and I'm happy to talk about that. Anyway, next slide, please. So again, these are the net 12 million jobs. You can see the states. There's a lot of overlap between the states, trade with Mexico, trade with Canada. Trade with Canada is actually more sizable than trade with Mexico in value. But basically, they're the states where there's manufacturing going on. The agriculture is important too, but the real value added is in manufacturing. Next slide, please. NAFTA, negotiated in the early 1990s. When Trump came in, he wanted to negotiate a new agreement. A lot of people fully agreed that NAFTA needed to be updated. They went through a difficult set of negotiations. They reached agreement in 2019, final agreement. A new agreement went into effect in 2020, and that's called USMCA in the United States. It has different names in each country. And that was the very clever name of the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. I always joke about that, because, and I think we all know who named it. Next slide, please. So basically, it was a modernized NAFTA, but it had a different name, and it had the support from the Republicans as well as the Democrats. So it actually became very popular if you looked at the polls. So it did change a few things. It set up something. Anybody know what a rule of origin is here? Probably not. Rule of origin is the rules for getting tariff-free entry into this free trade zone. And so it counted up how much of different things were made and stuff in a car, and if it fit those criteria, you didn't have to pay any tariffs. So it played with those. It changed some ways that you settle disputes. Very importantly, it updated, modernized the intellectual property protection, digital trade, all of that, because digital trade didn't even exist when NAFTA was negotiated. Think back in the early 90s, we didn't buy and sell a lot of things over the internet. And this agreement is going to be up for review in 2026. Next slide, please. People have been working pretty diligently to implement this. There are some disputes between the three countries, and we can talk about those. I'm not going to go through them here because probably most of you aren't interested in what the specific trade disputes are, but feel free to ask me any questions you want afterwards so we can talk about that. Overall, it's been going pretty well. Next slide, please. And yes, that one. So, as you can see, trade between the three countries grew almost 30% in these years up here as we were coming out of COVID, at least in part because of USMCA. Not totally, also because we were cutting trade off with China, but the trade was growing. Next slide, please. We also set up something new with Mexico renewed with Mexico called the High-Level Economic Dialogue. And I'm not going to go through all the things here that's important, but it's very important for you to understand that trade agreements only deal with a little part of economic relations between two countries. If you're going to be more competitive, you have to do a whole bunch of things other than just have a trade agreement. You have to invest in your infrastructure. Your borders have to work really fluidly. Your regulations have to be harmonious with each other. You have to have programs so your workers get training in their own countries and get the same kind of skills on both sides of the border. A lot of things that you have to do. So the U.S. set up a dialogue with Mexico to try and work on a number of those things. It's a dialogue we had started during the Obama administration, got canceled during the Trump administration, and was reinitiated during the Biden administration. Next slide, please. The other thing they did at the same time was they again started holding North American leaders summits, and they did this for the same reason. They said, look, there are a bunch of things we got to do between Canada, the United States, and Mexico if we really want to be competitive with China or competitive with the European Union. We cannot just do it by ourselves. And I'll just say, America only isn't going to work. You have to do it in partnership with others. And so this was an effort to start developing this partnership, have a dialogue about this more seriously with Canada, Mexico, and the United States on all sorts of issues, including health issues. For example, how do you handle a pandemic? If we get another pandemic, what lessons did we learn from the last one? How can our authorities work better to keep the economy going in all three countries, to keep the borders going forward? Just an example. Next slide, please. Same thing. The environment is another one of these things, and then migration and security, another area where there needed to be broader discussion across the whole continent. Next, please. This is just to show that there's a lot of investment between the three countries. I'll let you take a minute and look at this, but the simple thing is Canada has an amazing amount of investment in the United States. Mexico has 50% of all of its investment abroad in the United States. It's a lot smaller because it's not a very wealthy country. And the United States has a lot of money invested in its two neighbors, but that's only 9% of the total amount of US investment in the world because we are a global economic power. They aren't, they're regional powers. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so when AMLO got elected in 2018, he won a very large majority. As you can see, he got 53%, which in Mexico is a sweeping victory. His predecessors have not had that high of a victory since the 1990s. And so he won a big majority in Congress, and he was promising something he called the fourth transformation of Mexico. And the other transformations were during the Civil War and Revolution in the early part of the 1900s, during the Benito Juarez revolution, which was a liberal revolution, a sort of a democratic revolution, and then the independence from Spain. So what he was saying is, we're going to make a gigantic change in Mexico, just like has happened 3 other significant times. And so he promised a lot of changes. Next slide, please. People have liked what he said. He is very popular with I guess what we would call the lower middle class, the working class, and the poor. Above that, he's not quite so popular in the other social layers, but he's very popular there. And so even in the last month, his last popularity rating was 60% approval rating, which is not bad as you're ending your 6-year term in office. Next slide, please. He promised reducing inequality across the economy. He promised, I'm going to invest, we're going to re-strengthen our national energy companies and make sure that energy remains as a national treasure, and we control that. Next slide, please. He said, I'm going to reduce poverty, and he's done that. We're going to attack corruption and government inefficiency. Next slide, please. And he said, we're going to really turn around this public security situation. And he had this phrase called hugs, not bullets. And of course, for those who liked his proposal, they liked that. For those who now sharply criticize his proposal for producing no results, they say, well, that's the problem. You know, you're hugging the criminals, you're not putting them in jail. Next slide, please. So after 5 years, as said, he remains very popular. USMCA and the US-Mexico economic cooperation have worked really well. Mexico's economy, it's done pretty well. Big recession during COVID, bounced back. It's growing at 3%, 3.2%. But why has it done that? In large part because of USMCA and being able to sell things to the United States and getting all those remittances back from the United States. Poverty has been reduced, but extreme poverty has actually increased. And there were 30 million Mexicans that do not have access to health care that had access to health care before. So, it's positive, but it's not, it's mixed. Next slide, please. Crime. Mexico a study came out in 2023 saying that Mexico has the 3rd worst criminality in the world, which is worse than it had before. As we said before, fentanyl is still being produced. Impunity, I haven't mentioned impunity. Impunity is when you commit a crime, but you don't get brought to justice for it. So the impunity rate, the rate with which criminals get away with their crimes, is 92% in Mexico on average, overall. So that's a pretty high rate. And AMLO has been very, very critical of anybody that criticizes him or blocks him. So he's regularly attacked the Supreme Court, the electoral authorities, non-governmental organizations, individuals, the press. And he's now proposed a number of constitutional reforms, which he hopes he may be able to get passed after the election if his party wins 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress. We'll talk about it. Next, please. A lot of very poor human rights and democracy indicators on Mexico, and corruption indicators over the past years also. Next, please. You can ask about those. I'll be happy to talk to you. And this sort of reflective of this, the Pew Survey. Pew Survey is a very respected survey that looks at opinion around the world. They recently did a survey of about 35 countries, and they found the country that had the largest growth in support for autocratic regimes of countries that you would consider, not dictatorships right now, was Mexico. And what this, I think, reflects is how popular AMLO is and how people think that he's making all the decisions. That's okay. And of course, we see something similar. If anybody knows about the situation in El Salvador, it's a bit similar to this. Next, please. And the criticisms of AMLO are around all the things I just mentioned. We can come back and talk about him, but he is sharply criticized by a lot of people in Mexico and a lot of experts, but he remains very popular. Next slide, please. Migration, next slide. The only thing I wanted to remind everybody here is that the big change in the last couple of years has been the jump in number of people from other places than Mexico or Central America. And this reflects the fact that there are about 20 million people in our hemisphere on the move, looking for a better place to live. Next slide, please. This is the backlog in the immigration courts of the United States. It's all-time high, 3.6 million January of this year. This is why we need immigration reform. This is why I strongly wish our Congress could get their act together and actually agree on this. Our system is old, it's creaky, it does not work well, and it does not serve the interests of the United States very well right now. Next slide, please. Next slide. So what's happened in the last few years is the U.S. and Mexico have agreed on a lot of mechanisms so they can talk regularly about these problems. That's a big, important step. Doesn't solve the problems, but at least they're talking to each other. And they've done that across all the areas that we've talked about. Next slide, please. But they now actually have to produce results, and they have to get through this election year in both countries, where people in both countries are going to blame the other country for the problems that they're facing. And we see this a lot already with certain people attacking Mexico for not better controlling its border, for the drug problems, for the migration problems, for other things which are not completely unfounded, but the solutions they put forward are unlikely to actually solve the problems that we have right now. And we can talk through there a number of other ones. Next slide, please. Again, next slide, we'll do the next slide. Okay, the elections, next. Okay, so June 2nd elections, national elections in Mexico. We're coming up on our relations. As I said, how do we manage this situation? So far, both the Biden administration and the AMLO administration are actually sort of going out of their way to try not to exacerbate any of these problems. Other people in their polities are not being so kind about what they say, but the two administrations see that there's a lot at stake, and they're actually not trying to stir the fires. Next slide, please. So the elections are on June 2nd. They're going to elect the president, both houses of Congress, a number of governorships, and then thousands of lower level jobs across the whole country. Next slide. So here we are. We are So May 29, the campaign ends. June 2nd, the election takes place. So we're getting close to seeing who comes out on top in this election. There are two coalitions, one aligned with AMLO. Together, we're going to make history, is what that says. And then Our Force and Our Heart for Mexico, which are the opposition parties, which tend to be more conservative, but they aren't, they're actually left and right. They're mainly united by their opposition to the current president of Mexico. Next slide, please. So these are the two candidates, two women. So it's quite likely there's going to be a woman as the next president of Mexico, the first woman to be president of Mexico. There's actually a third candidate, but I didn't put him up here because he was polling about 6%, and it is a he. So Claudia Sheinbaum was mayor of Mexico City. She is the candidate favored by AMLO. Then Xochitl Galvez is the opposition candidate. Claudia Sheinbaum is an engineer with an environmental background and has done, I think she got her PhD at Berkeley, so she's an environmental scientist. Ms. Galvez is a businesswoman who raised herself up from a very poor family. One of her parents is was an indigenous Mexican, is her mother. And she worked her way through college and became a business, got a degree, founded a business, was fairly successful in business, and sort of surprisingly rose up. It was really a surprise to become the candidate of the opposition, but she's a very fiery and lively orator. And she's very much in favor of small business and entrepreneurship and that kind of a solution for Mexico's future. Claudia Sheinbaum is much more in the camp of a strong role for the state in building prosperity. Next slide, please. So right now, Claudia Sheinbaum is about 25 points ahead in the poll. It varies a little bit. Some say 30, some say 20 points. So, but she seems to have a pretty big advantage. And this is AMLO's candidate, remember, the candidate of the current president. Next slide, please. There are a lot of discrepancies in Mexico's polls, so you have to take whatever they say with a few grains of salt. That's what this slide is telling you. Next slide, please. The other race that's really important is the congressional race. So, because what the president needs, especially what AMLO wants and his candidate, is to get 2/3 of a majority in both houses of Congress, then they can change the Constitution. It's a lot easier to change the Constitution in Mexico than in the United States. But if they can do that, they have a number of proposals that many experts say would weaken the court system, would weaken the independent authorities, would weaken the election system in Mexico. So the other thing we have to look carefully for is who gets what majority coming out of the elections. And there we are. Okay. So
my question just relates to human trafficking and the cartel's involvement in that. Is that a newer thing or no?
Human trafficking is not a new thing.
No. But the cartels.
I don't think the cartels are really involved in human trafficking. They're involved in paying taxes to migrant smugglers. They charge people to pass through their territory and to cross the border. And so there are two different things. Human trafficking is usually where people are taken away from their families and smuggled into the United States to be used either for labor or for sex. Migrant smuggling, which is the much larger problem, are people who are paid by the migrants to get them into the United States. And what the cartels do there is they don't actually traffic the people, but they charge the migrant smuggler to cross their territory. And so I remember a couple of years ago, the estimate was that it was about $2,000 a person that they would charge in some of these places along the U.S. border to pass safely through their territory. Now, the cartels also used to use, they would give approval, you guys all go cross here, and then they would move drugs and other things up the river somewhere else because they knew the Border Patrol was all going to be busy with all these migrants coming. So they would also use it for diversion in order to get other things moving across the border. So I haven't seen much evidence that the cartels are actually smuggling people. Doesn't mean they don't, maybe that some do, but most of it seems to be by others.
This is a question that's a business one, so it's kind of shifting gears. Is the 807 law still in place where you were only having to pay duty on the added value? I was with Samsonite back in the 80s and 90s, and we used that with plants at Nogales and El Paso to make soft-side luggage. Rather than losing all the jobs to the Far East that some of our competitors were doing, we kept a lot of the manufacturing in the U.S. that way, and I wondered if that's still in existence.
Mexico still has the Maquiladora law, which is what many of you might have heard about it. It's a law that they passed actually before NAFTA, I think, in order to try to get U.S. and other companies to invest in that northern area along the U.S.-Mexico border. And basically the rule is if you bring raw materials in, transform them, and then send them back out of Mexico, you don't have to pay any taxes on them at all. And that does still exist.
Added value. In other words, the labor content or the labor
yes.
cost in Mexico is much less than the U.S.
Yes, you do. And that's the cost of when it's all put together. The value going out, you don't have to pay a tax on that. And so they have much lower tax rates for those companies and those installations that do that. Now, there has been a boom in investment in these industrial parks to do that kind of production in the last several years, largely because we have raised tariffs on things coming from China. And so what they've done is they've just moved a lot of those more simple, not heavy manufactured stuff, more simple processes to these industrial parks. So there are now a lot of toys, for example, plastic things, other things being made in that zone, and maybe luggage too, that was being made in Asia before. And the other thing, it's not just the tariffs, it's costs a lot more money to ship things across the Pacific now in post-COVID period than it did previously.
Another question, Pat?
Yeah, I've struggled with the word encounters. I assume it's illegal immigrants, but it's hard to know how many stay, how many get returned, or what is meant by the term encounters.
The term encounters mean that the Border Patrol encounters somebody. Now,
I mean, it's an encounter.
I understand it's not clear, and that's precisely the reason they use it. So if you go on, it's a very interesting, you should go on and explore this. The CBP has a monthly statistical, you can get graphs and all sorts of other things, looking at the number of people that they encounter, where they're from, if they came in a family unit, if they were children, minor children, if there are other things. You can trace these numbers, and they put it all out there. They started using encounters because when we were using Title 42 during COVID, which you might not remember, but it was the thing that allowed you to send people back across the border. What would happen was that people would come across the border 5 or 6 times. So the number of encounters were really high. So if you may remember the numbers during the Trump years and the beginning of the Biden years were really high. Well, they were really high because 20, 30% of those people were actually repeat returners. And now we've switched to a system where if you get sent back and then you come across again, you can go to jail for 5 years. So that's a whole shift in situation. And it doesn't deter everybody, of course, but it deters more people from trying to come back several times. But they've stuck with the encounters terminology. They used to have apprehensions, but as they were thinking about it, it just seemed, heck, we're getting these same people we're encountering 5, 6, 7 times, yeah, and we're just sending them right back. They're not really apprehensions. We're encountering them, and then we send them back. Now, one of the problems that's happened in the recent years is there are not big enough facilities to hold people who claim asylum, and so they've had to release them into the United States with a court date and other things. And of course, the Republicans get all over the administration for doing that. The administration said, well, if you gave us money to create bigger things here, we're under court order not to mistreat people, So, it's gone back and forth. And that's why I thought it was so sad that when they came up with a bipartisan Senate agreement that would have dealt with some, not all these problems, or some of these problems, it just got thrown out. And as you may remember, the last time we came up with a bipartisan immigration reform was in 2013, when Senator McCain and others joined together, and again, a bipartisan agreement, and again, it was the House of Representatives that wouldn't pass that bipartisan agreement, and we've been paying the price for over 10 years, and longer than that, of the inability of our elected leaders to actually compromise and come up with a system that could better deal with these problems. And again, I put it in the context. We're not generating the migrants. The migrants are being generated by situations in their own countries that they're fleeing in most cases. If it were just young men looking for jobs, the numbers would be a lot lower than people who are being driven by a combination of horrible situations to get out of their countries.
What are Mexico's hopes and fears regarding the upcoming U.S. election?
That's a good question. Well, I was just thinking about this today, because when AMLO was first elected, he had to deal with President Trump. Of course, President Trump was in office then. And he basically found a way to give President Trump most anything he asked for. And the trade-off was President Trump didn't criticize anything he was doing inside of Mexico. Now, I don't know if that would work again this time, or if there would be different demands. For example, there was a Rolling Stone article last week. Nobody probably reads Rolling Stone anymore. I don't even read it, since 15, 20, 30 years. But they had an article where it said Trump was planning to send special forces teams in to assassinate cartel leaders if he got in office again. If the United States did that, no matter who was president of Mexico, you would have a major crisis with Mexico. Just think if another country sent secret teams in the United States to kill people they didn't like. We would be upset, as we're arrested this Sikh recently, or the Sikhs who were arrested in Canada, for killing Sikhs, Indian agents who were arrested. It would be a very, very, very difficult situation. We'll see what happens. I think what the difference would be, the Biden administration would continue on the path it's currently on, which is trying to build a partnership, but if the partnership doesn't work, taking specific targeted steps to increase the cost of not improving the situation. If Trump administration comes in, we will see classic Donald Trump. You don't know. what he might do next to up the pressure, because, as you know, he's a hard negotiator, and he negotiates with bold, tough steps, sometimes that break a lot of crockery. And I think that's what the Mexicans are worried about if he gets reelected. AMLO won't be president. There'll be a woman as president. How will Trump interact with that new president? And how much will he seek to maximize U.S. leverage to get what he wants? So I think that's what they're probably worried about. I mean, first they're going to get through their own election, then they'll worry about it. Right now they're focused on that.
Are we doing anything about the gun smuggling problem?
We have started doing something about the gun smuggling problem, but sadly only in the last maybe 2.5 years or so. And there have been many more arrests in the United States over the last year of people trying to smuggle guns out of the country to the south. The government of Mexico also has a court case pending in the U.S. courts, which so far has not been thrown out, even though they've tried to throw it out several times, which is alleging that U.S. gun companies are not exercising enough care in what happens to their guns once they sell them to these gun shops and things. And so they're trying to exert pressure that way to have more care taking place. They're not questioning Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution or the ability of U.S. citizens to have as many guns as they want to have. They're just questioning, don't let these guns come into the United States, into Mexico from the United States. Now, the Mexicans also have a role to play here. They need to be better at checking their own borders also for guns coming in and flowing south. So this needs to be something where they invest in this also. But there's no doubt that there needs to be a better and a more trusting collaboration between both governments to stop these kind of flows. And it's not just guns, it's the guns and the ammunition, and then you have the problem of the ghost guns and the gun kits and all of this stuff. But it's very complicated. In a number of parts of Mexico, the cartels greatly outgun the police because they can buy bigger and more modern weapons than the local police can.
Can you speak to the U.S. interest in the June 2nd election with the two leading candidates? How will they handle relationships with the U.S. differently?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I'm waiting to see that also. I think that the opposition candidate is clearly has a focus on entrepreneurship and the private sector and energizing the Mexico economy through energizing private sector participation. So I think that candidate will look to deepening the trade and investment relationships with the United States as a way to empower, grow, modernize Mexico. Claudia Sheinbaum of AMLO's party is not opposed to that, but she does seem to favor a very strong role for the national authorities in the economy along the lines of AMLO. She is more sensitive to AMLO on environmental issues, on the need for clean energy, greener energy. And so I think that will be a shift from what AMLO has done. She says she does favor these reforms that may be put forward that would, for example, have national election for all Supreme Court judges and coincided with presidential elections, which many say, well, this is just going to politicize all this, and who's going to determine that the candidates have any legal background whatsoever if they're running for election? And so there are a lot of problems with these proposals, but her mentor has put them forward, and so she is currently supporting those. So a lot of the questions revolve around if Claudia Sheinbaum gets elected, will she distance herself? Can she distance herself from such a popular president as this guy, and in what time frame? And we really don't know right now. I think both of them will both try to keep strong economic ties with the United States. I think I think for each of them, some of the big challenges are going to be dealing with the security problems in the country, which I think everybody is widely agreed need to be better controlled. And if that means closer cooperation with the United States or not. I think with the opposition, that would mean yes. We don't know yet about Claudia Sheinbaum, what her preferences will be.
Yes, I'm wondering if you could briefly describe the Chinese-Mexican relationship.
Oh, that's a good, yes, that's good. So the Chinese-Mexican relationship is not close. You may not remember, but China basically replaced Mexico in the late 1990s and early 2000s as the main supplier to the United States. And they took a lot of what had been investment in Mexico and had it shifted to China. And so there's this sort of long rivalry. In the interim, the Mexicans believe they've strengthened their own capacity, the skill of their workers, other things that they are now able to compete in a number of sectors with China. They don't have very close political relations. I mean, they're not enemies, but they're not particularly buddy-buddy with each other. But what has happened is since the United States put all these tariffs on Chinese goods, a number of Chinese companies have said, well, we should just go invest in Mexico. And so what you've seen that in so far is a lot of smaller manufacturing companies, no big companies. But you've also seen what the United States is more steel coming in to Mexico and aluminum from China at lower prices being reworked, transformed in Mexico, and then sent to the United States as Mexican product, so you don't have to pay tariffs on it. So the United States has started complaining about that and telling Mexico, you can't do that, or we're going to have a big problem. And then what you saw this week was Biden announcing we're going to put these big tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, and others saying that we're going to be very concerned if there's any Chinese investment to build electrical vehicles in Mexico. There is no electric vehicle manufacturing by China in Mexico right now. There are no plants that we know of being built there to do this kind of manufacturing, but it could happen. They do sell electric vehicles, and Chinese electric vehicles are very popular in many countries because you can buy them. They're affordable. And the Mexicans have responded to the complaints about steel and aluminum by putting new tariffs on anybody's steel and aluminum coming into Mexico from countries where they don't have a free trade agreement, and they don't have a free trade agreement with China. So they are responding to some of these concerns that the United States has raised. But it's something that there needs to be continued dialogue between the two countries on how to manage this as you go forward. And as you know, the United States is still has a very strong economic relationship with China. They are still our third largest supplier of goods in the United States. It's not like we've cut China off. We have not. We've only cut off certain parts of that or raised the price of bringing things into the United States. So anyway, yes, it's an important topic and good to think about.
You just answered the question.
That was it, okay.
So understanding that all immigration has a push and pull factor, how does the United States, in the absence of a partnership with Mexico, deal with that pull factor of job seekers coming into the country? What have we done in the past? What could we be doing legislatively to address that question?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that for a long time, it's been evident the United States should have a temporary worker program that goes beyond agriculture. The United States economy needs a lot of workers. We have a lot of Americans who don't want to do a lot of work. And we have all sorts of companies now that are finding a very hard time to get the skilled workers that they need. And I think we could have a program that was well managed, that was tracked, that you knew who was coming, how long they were staying, for actually having workers come who don't intend to come and stay, but are coming to make money for a few years. And maybe they come and they work for 9 months and go back. Maybe they work for a year and go back and have to get renewed. I think our economy would greatly benefit from that. And it could be quite a manageable system. Canada has a system like this that they work. Now, this wouldn't solve everything. I mean, I also think we should move to a point system for immigrants coming in the United States. We should favor people with skills coming in, not just because they happen to be a second cousin of somebody who already lives here. But that's a big reform that you have to undertake in the immigration system. And all of this, a prerequisite for all of this is people actually have to be able to have civil conversations with each other to look at what the real pros and cons of substance are, not the emotional, let's ring the bell kind of thing to, about the other. I mean, we need a lot of the other. And we, of course, sell to all these other countries, all the time too, and get a lot of our wealth from exporting to other countries. So there's a nice mean here that we could find that could help with the migration problem. It's not going to solve it, because why are the Venezuelans coming to the United States in large numbers, or Nicaraguans coming in large numbers? Because they decided it's hell to live in their countries right now. And so we do have to think about why they're coming. How do you address them? How do you help provide humanitarian protection for all these people? So it's a big, long problem that you have to deal with. And the Europeans have the same thing, as you often read about the boats sinking in the Mediterranean, all these people trying to desperately to get to Europe from places in Africa where it also is just horrible to be living. So it's a big, complex problem. We're not going to solve it easily. We're going to have to manage it over years and hopefully get better at trying to deal with these really serious problems. But there are some things we could do just that would benefit us in the shorter term with our own immigration system.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Tony Wayne. Please join me in thanking our speaker.